For this video lecture in the International Relations class, I want to talk about the evolution of the modern state system, particularly focusing on the Western European region where they came out of, and then those handful of states dominated the rest of the world for several centuries. So we'll back up to 10,000 years ago. Prior to that, humans existed primarily in bands of hunter-gatherers, herders, not really settled anywhere. And I don't think there's a whole lot of argument that the single most important innovation that kick-started human civilization was the domestication of plants and animals, agriculture. It's hard to overestimate how important that was in order to build human communities where people would settle in one place, create the agricultural systems, domesticating of wheat, growing crops, building communities from there, and from that point, institutions start to form, cities and towns. Onset of human civilization has started about that time. We start to see patterns of organizations start to form as people live together in larger and larger communities. We have to have some sort of organization, so laws start to come about, people's property rights in order to have respect for other people's property, markets, exchange systems, village structures. There's just so many things that came up out of this agricultural-based society that started to build these human communities. We started to have division of labor. We also started to see disease resistance when larger and larger groups of people would live together with domesticated animals. They developed disease resistance. So it grew from there. Jump forward to around 1000 AD in Common Era. The institutions had been forming for quite a while, but as we get into this period, particularly in the Western European region, Holy Roman Empire, some very important institutions were really starting to take shape, such as court systems in order to enact that rule of law, trial by juries in order to judge the law, estate managers, property owners, the nobles and the barons that were in charge of all the property and keeping track of that, the record keeping of the systems, the tax collecting. We'll get into how all this dovetailed into the creation of the modern state, but these institutions had been forming in order to create some sort of structure, organization, the forerunner to our modern bureaucratic systems, and these were all in the midst of the multi-ethnic empires. This was the order of the day, with emperors conquering vast expanses of land. Here in the Western European region, we have the Catholic Church maintaining considerable moral control over the area, so the popes were very powerful. The kings would then appoint things to the nobles who were in charge of the land that would the peasants and the commoners and the serfs would work the land. This period is what Hobbes would describe later on as life in this region. For if you weren't a pope, a king, or a noble, life is pretty nasty, brutish, and short. One other major document that came out of this period was the Magna Carta, which most importantly established a council of barons that would be a decision-making group that eventually evolved into the Parliament, which is the system that the United States government was based on. So how did the state evolve? The decline of this feudal system had to occur before the modern state starts to come up out of that. So there's lots of things that were happening around this time in Western Europe, and we kind of narrow it down into these 2 centuries as to what a lot was happening in this period that contributed to the decline and fall of the feudal system, and then in its aftermath we see the formation of this modern state system that we have today. Somewhat ironically, the plague, which of course was very devastating, In that period, in the late 1300s, it wiped out as much as 75% of the population in many areas. But what it also did in the aftermath was increase the value of labor. The serfs, the commoners, the peasants became so much more scarce that their labor was much needed, so they had more value on that labor, and therefore a little bit more leverage, a little bit more power in getting better conditions for their situation. Still not far from perfect, but much more improved. We also start to see other innovations, economic innovations, as far as development of more agricultural methods of crop rotation. We also see the beginnings of mass production, or be more efficient means. We're looking at trade between these regions. We're creating new defense technology. Quite importantly, gunpowder and cannons were a type of defense technology that was more conducive to defending a more defined territory rather than these vast empires that were typically conquered with armies on horseback. The merchant class, with all this agricultural innovation, trade, mass production, development of early forms of capitalism with currencies, the merchant class starts to gain more and more power and starts to supersede the noble class. The king actually starts to shift his preference more to the merchant class because of all the benefits that are coming out of this. And what we're also seeing in this period is that there's a shift. All of these things combined start to create a territorially defined authority that is more efficient, more practical to use with all these new changes and innovations and the falling of the feudal system. And as a result, we start to see political fragmentation as well in this Western European region. The Holy Roman Empire starting to fracture up as well. They fracture along ethnic lines, so we have the Brits, the Germans, the Spanish, the forerunners to these groups, the Italians, the Belgians, the Danish. All of these groups started to fracture off into their own territorially defined authorities, which was becoming more efficient for them to work in that way rather than these vast, multi-ethnic, expansive empires. So then the state really starts to form in the aftermath of this fall of the feudal system and all these other things that are starting to happen in Western Europe. For the next few centuries, this modern state starts to take shape. As I mentioned, there is not just political fragmentation, but a massive amount of competition between these groups, particularly in Western Europe, which led to a lot of conflict, but also led to a lot of innovation. This was the area and the period of the Renaissance. And then we get into the Enlightenment, which were game-changing periods for human civilization as far as the ideas that were coming up out of this area with scientific inquiry, representative governments, liberalism, which of course is what the United States system is based on. And the wars were also prevalent because of this competition for territory and innovation. And another interesting analogy here is how the modern state started to take shape was because of all this competition and conflict that the state kind of served as somewhat of a protection racket, I guess you could say, and they would need to extract resources in the form of taxes and goods from their merchants in order to protect them. So interesting analogy there, a way of explaining how they started to take shape out of necessity. And the state that was forming at this time said, well, we need resources in order to protect this territory that we are starting to define. Taxes and protection and give and takes, things like that was starting to come about. So the wars were pretty devastating and constant during this period. And the Treaty of Westphalia served to define another concept of sovereignty. So at this point, at the Treaty of Westphalia, it was determined that, okay, once Your territory is defined, and my territory is defined. That's your business, and this is my business. So this concept of sovereignty, which is probably the number one rule in our international system, even to this day, means that once we each recognize each other as that being your territory and this being my territory, then you take care of your business and I'll take care of my business. So that was a very major turning point in this period. And then what we start to develop are the concepts of citizens. This is my territory, so these are my people. Now I have borders. I have defined territory that I can protect or use the resources within that territory. And then the loyalty over a period of time is now starting to shift. It's shifting from the family, it's shifting from the church, and it's shifting to this new entity that is coming about. So therefore, the people are giving moral authority to this new entity to protect these institutions that have come about, such as their rule of law, their property rights, things like that. And even Thomas Hobbes, who was writing at that time, around 1651, was recognizing this new shift to this common power, is what he called it. And we've already mentioned that, I think, once before, is that humans are going to have to sacrifice a little bit of their freedom in order to get the protection from this common power. Otherwise, it's going to be, as he said, a nasty, brutish, and short life on this earth unless we can get organized. Then the national identity of that territory then starts, through socialization processes, starts to bond future generations in creating civil societies in that territory. Here is a spreadsheet that puts it all together in a timeline. As you can see, as we get into the Common Era of 1000 AD, the institutions had long been forming. We've got the feudal system, nobles creating their own little fiefdoms, commoners, peasants, serfs, multi-expansive empires here, and then feudalism starts to break down in this period right here. These are the points that we just talked about, resulting in territorially defined authorities. We also see the Protestant Reformation was also instrumental in this breakup of the Holy Roman Empire. Colonization starts around this time as well, because these modern states that were forming in Western Europe became so powerful and so competitive, then they went out and conquered the rest of the world for resources under the concept of mercantilism, which we'll talk about in more detail. Treaty of Westphalia that set that standard of sovereignty that defined what your territory is going to be. And then our modern state starts to take shape in this period right here, with giving the moral authority to that entity to protect these institutions that we've been creating at this time. And then you could certainly argue that it was locked in by the time we get into the 1800s. The United States creates the first constitution. Colonialism, particularly from these Western European regions, really ramps up. We'll talk about the difference of that here in a minute. Napoleon, his defeat was somewhat of a turning point in that the nation state would triumph over this autocracy as more of a natural state of citizens' allegiance. So the state gets another boost there. And then with the concept of nationalism, we create these other things here, such as the monopoly on the use of force, elite norms, civil society, and then also the U.S. Industrial Revolution. First there was England's Industrial Revolution, and then the United States Industrial Revolution really just pushed modern human development to the next level. So that kind of puts it in a little nutshell right there. Talking a little bit more about colonization in this first period, we're beginning with the Spanish and then the British Empire, and the Danish had one of the most powerful navies in the world, conquered vast amounts of territory all around the world. They would create these joint stock companies, which is the forerunner to our modern corporation. And they would delegate these joint stock companies, such as the British East Indies Company, the Dutch East Indies Company. They would delegate them to go out, and they would give them armies at their disposal to go out there and bring back the resources, all the goods that our rich country will need, even the luxury goods, the sugars and the spices. Under the mercantilism concept, they were hoarding silver and gold, and they were exploiting the natives' resources and labor doing that. They would oftentimes just buy off the tribal leaders in those regions and then use their native labor even as slave labor or very cheap labor, and they would have armies there to enforce that. Now, over time, these joint stock companies became big and bloated and bureaucratic and corrupt. And even Adam Smith, one of the things that was inspiring the writings of Adam Smith was these joint stock companies and their monopolistic behavior, and that the politicians were becoming literally just stooges to these joint stock companies. But they kind of made a shift around 1800 to the concept of colonialism. So rather than delegating it to these joint stock corporations to go out there and bring home the resources, what they did is that they just shifted to total political control and created the empires. But political control meant that now, rather than going out and exploiting the resources through these delegated joint stock companies, now they're just going to be part of our empire. They'll just be colonies, part of our empire, and then we will appoint royal governors who are our own people to run that territory. And that was up until World War II, when the concept of colonialism really started to break apart, and it wasn't until the 1960s until all the African states had been granted independence. But to give you an idea, by the early 20th century, about a dozen Western states from Western European region controlled about 3/4 of the entire global economy. That's how big and powerful they got. They got there first, became very powerful, and then dominated the rest of the world. This gives you the British Empire at perhaps its peak around World War I, most of Africa, Canada, and Australia, India, their biggest colonies there. This doesn't even include, prior to that, the Americas that we fought our independence for back in 1700s there. And this does not include the Spanish Empire, the Danish Empire, Belgian Empire, even the German and the French. They had vast empires, lots of territories. So the states system started to stick because it was a more efficient organization for lots of things. For extracting resources, this is my territory. So if I have these resources in my territory, like I said, this is my business. I can use them as I wish. And then I can also conduct my own economic relations within this territory and choose to trade my goods and my resources if I want to do that, if it's into my benefit to do that. And this monopoly on the use of armed forces is somewhat a subtle shift from people taking up their own sense of defense and revenge, where now they could delegate that to the state. The state would have the armed forces, so therefore the people could just let the state take care of that, and then they could take care of their own business and have their own lives while the state protected them in that manner. And that is considered by some social scientists as the major turning point there into a general pacification of human societies, where we don't have to take up arms for ourselves. We can now delegate that to the state. Elite norms start to call the shots. That's just how it works. The people that are in charge that got there and had the ideas, then those ideas start spread to that society, and we start to create what we call a civil society. We'll talk about that here in just a minute, where the people become a very healthy part of this this territory. This, therefore, effectively delegitimized any other forms of government. And they were so powerful and so controlling, all the other remaining empires, such as the Ottoman Empire, even the empire, the Han Dynasty, those things eventually started to break up and shift their societies as well in order to try to keep up with what had been dominated by these Western European states. So a little bit more on the civil society, that the people are giving and at the same time accepting government's authority to act on its behalf. Again, that varies from state to state, particularly in a democracy. This is where you have your more healthy civil societies, which includes all kinds of groups, religious organizations, hobby groups, political movements, professional associations, any form of an interest group where people get together to enhance their own self-interests of that common interest and then use that to influence or lobby government for benefits. We also are looking at this idea that the civil society is partially independent of the state, but there is some sort of balance, because not only could there be tensions with the state, but there's also the support of the state, because the people are the ones that are providing those candidates and those bureaucrats and those politicians. So what we have here is this concept of a balance, which is hard to measure, hard to you can almost kind of tell when you don't have it, but a healthy balance where you've got a trust of the government, but at the same time a healthy skepticism of government for them not to get into too much power or to abuse their power. So this concept of a civil society is essential for a healthy functioning of democracy. So now I just want to talk for the remaining few minutes here that the state system, which has been around for over 500 years now and has brought tremendous benefits and innovations to humanity, it's got some challenges to it. That doesn't mean that it's destined to be the only system that we have. So what I want to do is talk about some of the challenges to this state system that we're seeing in today's world. One, of course, is that it remains anarchic, and there's some concerns about that. As long as we have states that are competing against each other, that prospect of conflict is still there. Inequality is still pretty rampant, particularly as we go more to a global capitalist system. Inequality is going to potentially worsen, and that we still, particularly looking for the realist point of view, the states have their own self-interest that they're going to be pursuing. Competition, of course, is not always bad, but could lead to some of these dysfunctional aspects here in an anarchic system where there's no global governance. Nobody is really in charge overall. That may never happen. That may be asking a little bit too much, where now we have states, the powerful states, kind of calling the shots or taking the lead, influencing others, directing others, perhaps even still controlling others. But without a global governance, resolutions are going to remain difficult. We'll talk an entire class on international law and how that is still literally in the developing stages today as we speak, because it's very difficult for states to come together and agree on some sort of legal body to make decisions. And authoritarian states continue to abuse their own citizens. That's why there is a quest for democracy in so many regions of the world, that's going to be less if you have more democracies. So that becomes still kind of a conflict between states, because a lot of states prefer an authoritarian leadership. They still feel like that's best for their peoples. The state is also appears to be becoming increasingly unable to serve the interests of its people. This utilitarian concept, which seemed to be a very good concept for what a state was to do, and that's to provide the best benefits for the greatest number of people. That does not appear really to be much of the goal anymore. It's more of a power elite slash wealthy driven type society where the powerful corporations and the wealthy individuals have most of the influence on government and on policy making, whereas the not just the poor minorities, but even the middle class seems to be shrinking. Governments are becoming more disconnected from people, primarily because they're becoming more divided within. We can see the United States as a prime example of this, as our polarization is actually increased, where the two parties are more like factions now that are just trying to either maintain power, to stay in power, or to get back in power, seeming to be the main goal at the expense of addressing major problems. Small states still remain dependent on larger states, and if we continue to see the pursuit of ethnic groups that want to break up into their own states, we'll continually see small states that are not completely self-sufficient and would still rely on larger states. The world as we know it, there's more and more problems that are becoming global concerns. It's not just a regional problem, particularly what we're dealing with right now. Disease is a global concern in order to try to prevent the diseases and pandemics from spreading from one country to the next. Poverty is a global concern. Rely on other states for help where the people are impoverished that need help. Environment obviously is a global concern. Global warming, for example, or pollution. Pollution, when it gets to a border, it doesn't stop. It just keeps on going. So there's lots of issues out there that need to be addressed at the global level or at an international level. Economic interdependence, which of course is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is providing a challenge to this sovereign state system as states become more and more interdependent and dependent upon each other for their economies, for products, for trade and for investment and for aid and things like that. It's going to perhaps clash with sovereignty, that this idea of sovereignty may be eroding because of this interdependence. The need for trade, we're also seeing a kind of a pushback against trade. There's authoritarian leaning regimes, such even the Trump administration is pushing back on international engagement and trying to get trade deals that are more self-interested rather than looking at global benefits. The poor states still need investment. They still need aid from the rich states. In this world, as concerns become more global, we may need to delegate more issues to these international organizations, these nationalist-leaning administrations, that they are pushing back from international organizations. There is more of a self-interested nationalist type sentiment there. And then finally, the concept of ethno-nationalism, where ethnic groups that cannot coexist or get along with other groups within their state, they want to break apart into their own nation state. So these are groups that are bound through culturally homogeneous populations, and they want a state boundary that coincides with their population, and that this could be just an increasingly smaller territory, a smaller state that may not necessarily be self-sufficient. And this idea of nationalism then feeds that so-called right to have a state that matches, where those borders match our culture and ethnicity. Yes, they did not get that during colonialism, but to do it now could be problematic, and that brings us to this concept of self-determination, upon which the United States was founded upon, because we wanted to determine our own future. We wanted independence from the British Empire. But today, is it self-determination, or is it more just a matter of separatist movements that want to break away because they can't coexist with the other groups in their state territory? So this wraps up the lecture on the state system. These are the challenges that are facing it today as we speak. We have seen considerable amount of progress and innovation because of this evolution of the state system, but we are seeing some serious challenges to it that could be threatening the concept of sovereignty or potentially creating more problems as a result.